to get started here in just a minute. Let me share my sound and we can let people in the room. Here we go. Good evening. Good evening, everyone. Welcome to Veterans Breakfast Club. This is Greatest Generation Live for July 18th. It's great to see you all. I'm going to hit the mute all button, but we will be able to unmute you in case you have a question later in the program. And Glenn, I'll ask you to unmute now. Welcome to tonight's program. It's great to see you all here this evening. We are billing this program tonight as sort of the bookend for the last several months of the air war over Europe. So I've been very excited to listen in on tonight's discussion with Glenn, and I know that we have Colin and Greg, several other Steve Snyder. I saw you pop into the room. We have several other experts in the room joining us tonight, so we have a great discussion planned for this evening. But Glenn, how are you doing?
I'm doing fine. Beautiful day in Pittsburgh. At least it wasn't 100 degrees.
Absolutely. I'd take this every day of the week. But just to let you all know, in case you are new to us, this is the Veterans Breakfast Club, and our mission is to create communities of listening around veterans and their stories to connect, educate, heal, and inspire. We've been doing it for 16 years, both in person and online, and all of our programs are made possible by your generous support, and we invite you to donate to the VBC to keep these programs running. You can do that on our website, www.veteransbreakfastclub.org. And on there, you can not only donate, but you can look up all of our past programs, veteran tributes. It's a new tribute wall that we have that you can submit for if you're a veteran or know a veteran. You would like to submit information to me to have their information or your information put up on our website. There's a blog, there's a magazine, you can subscribe. There's a whole lot of stuff to look at on the website. But I'll come back later with a station break. Without further ado, Glenn, I'd love to hand it off to you.
Okay, great. Thanks very much. Yeah, thank you all for being here. It's a beautiful Thursday evening, so I'm not going to question anybody's sanity in terms of tuning in to listen to me talk versus sitting on your back patio with the glass of wine in your hand, but I'm glad you're with us. Very pleased you're with us. And I see Ed Cottrell here. Ed, if we could get you to wave hello. Those of you who have been on our program, Ed's here just about every Thursday night. Ed's our 102-year-old P-47 pilot who we've interviewed several times. Most of you know him quite well. And Ed is coming with us to England in just another 6 or 7 weeks here. We'll be leaving on that England air bases trip. We have 31 people going. We're really excited. Ed and his daughter are joining us. So thank you, Ed. Thanks for being with us tonight. I don't know, do we have any other World War II vets that I'm not seeing any right now with us? I invited a couple of others, but it was all sort of last minute, so not a surprise. And I just want to thank, I see Colin Heaton on tonight. I see Nancy Putman. I see, who else? Steve Snyder. We haven't seen you in a while, Steve. How have you been? If you could, let me unmute Steve. Where is he?
There he is.
You got him? Okay.
I got him.
Thank you. Yeah, it's good to be here. I was just in your neck of the woods last week.
I know. How did that go for you?
Oh, it was great. Although all my flights were delayed, so I got to the Vintage Wings Museum 45 minutes late. But the crowd was great. They stayed there. They were a great group. It was a great atmosphere being under the C-53 plane that they have there. I'm having a brain freeze. Beach City Baby. That's the name of the plane. So it was a great setting. Sold a case of books. Met a lot of new people. So I had a lot of fun.
Great, great. Glad you had a good time in Pennsylvania and a good, nice presentation, I'm sure. So let me, Glenn Flickinger. I'm the host of Greatest Generation Live. I've been doing this for 4 or 5 years. I'm on the board of the Veterans Breakfast Club. And for the last 6, 7 months now, every Thursday night, almost every Thursday night, we've done a program about the air war over Europe. All this got started because of the Masters of the Air program that many of you, but not all of you, have watched. Got started last December when we interviewed the author of Masters of the Air, Don Miller, who was just incredibly inspiring, an incredible, interesting man. And we started developing this theme of every Thursday having a program on about some aspect of the air war over Europe. Not just the 8th Air Force and the 100th Bomb Group, although that played a very important part in our programming. We've made a lot of great friends. Nancy Putman's on. Nancy is with the 100 Bomb Group Foundation. She brought us quite a few people that we were able to interview. And I'll be mentioning them a little bit. Colin Heaton, we got to know. Colin was one of the technical advisors to the making of Masters of the Air. Colin knows all things Luftwaffe, as many of you know, have come to appreciate his knowledge. Steve Snyder, author of Shot Down, story of his father being shot down over Europe in 1944 and fighting with the Belgian resistance. And I could go on and on and on. And in fact, that's what I'm going to do right now. I'm going to go on and on and on. Hopefully, I'll stop every once in a while and ask for comments or questions. This is based on all of these programs, 20-some programs that we've done. It's also based on a presentation that I've been making to many local libraries and historical societies, anybody that would invite me to come talk about the air war over Europe. I've changed it a bit from that presentation, simply because it's a little different talking to all of you. And I'm going to start this slideshow here and share my screen. Oops, nope, I got to back up and do it a little different. Because you guys have all already heard so much of this. So I'm going to try to hit the high spots and try to share some of the understandings, some of the knowledge that I came to as the year progressed and the more and more people that we interviewed. So without further ado, actually, no, let me get this right. Slideshow, play from start. Here we go. Okay. Are we seeing that okay?
We see it.
Great. Air war over Europe. And what Todd had in the email that went out is very true. And we came to this understanding how we almost lost the air war in late 1943. It certainly was not clear that we were winning the air war. It was, in retrospect, always easy after the fact, more clear that we were losing it at that time. And then how did we win it? What were the men and the machines who turned it around? And that's what we're going to talk about like tonight. So this all starts with Don Miller's book, Masters of the Air. If you haven't read it, you really should read it. I'm going to mention half a dozen books in this presentation, but you got to start with him. 8th Air Force, as we know, I think many times we've talked about this, started in January of 1942 in Savannah, Georgia, which is why the 8th Air Force Museum is located there. Started with 7 men and no planes. It goes to England in March of 1942, and they've got 8 men and no planes. So literally starting from scratch. One of the things we focused on was the leadership. And this man was the leader of the U.S. Army Air Forces as it came to be known. And this is Hap Arnold. Fascinating man, driven man. The Hap part was because he always had this pleasant grin on his face. The reality was he was a hard-driving, hard-charging man. One of the original Air Force aviators. He was trained by the Wright brothers. He was one of the first 4 or 5 men, military men, taught by the Wright brothers. He becomes Marshall's right-hand man for the Air Force and the head of the Army Air Force in 1942. These men, also leaders of this whole effort. On your far left is Ira Eaker, General Ira Eaker, who was the first commander of the 8th Air Force. Originally, the 8th Bomber Command becomes the 8th Air Force. In the middle was the man that was most part of the war, his immediate superior, and that's Carl Spaatz, who becomes the head of the U.S. Army Strategic Air Forces throughout the European theater. On your far right is Bomber Harris, who was the head of the RAF Bomber Command starting in 1942. And we got into a lot of discussion about the different strategies, our daylight bombing versus the RAF night bombing, right? The technology is what drove this. This is the Norden bomb site. It's the one right out at Soldiers and Sailors Hall in Pittsburgh, developed in the 1920s and 1930s. This was the key to, I jumped off of that too quick. The key to what became the strategy for, and I apologize, my screen is not cooperating with me. It doesn't like me much today. The key to the development of daylight precision bombing. The old adage was you could drop a bomb in a pickle barrel from 25,000 feet with using this device. And it was a secret device for a long time. The other part of the technology that comes about in 1935 is this, as a prototype B-17 bomber. It was the first four-engine bomber ever conceived, ever produced. Prototype 1935, 1937, it goes into production, and the U.S. Army Air Corps at that time orders a whopping 17 of them. Eventually, we produced 14,000 of them during the war, right? The idea here was it could go faster than fighters at 250 miles per hour airspeed, carry a bomb load of 8,000 pounds, range of a couple thousand miles, and it could climb to 25 to 30,000 feet. So the thought was the bomber would always get through, was the phrase, and you didn't need fighter escorts. In fact, at that time, 1937, fighters could, or what we then called pursuit planes, could not keep up with these airplanes from a speed standpoint. We also developed this more in 1940, going to production, I believe, in 41, the B-24, or as Lucky Luckadoo says, this was the box that the B-17 came in, forever starting a controversy as to which plane was better. It's a great debate to have and will last forever and a day. We produced 18,000 plus of these. It was the most produced bomber of the war, right? Little heavier, a little longer range, carry a little heavier bomber load, but had some vulnerabilities. So it's important to understand why they came up with daylight precision bombing as a strategy. And I'm showing this in the next picture because this is from World War I. And what happened in World War I? How many millions of men died in the trenches in those 4+ terrible years? British lost almost 1 million men, the French 1 million plus, Germans 2+ million, the Russians countless millions, all because of fighting over the same sort of 10-mile stretch of territory, at least on the Western Front, and to some degree on the Eastern Front. But millions of men killed by being mowed down by these machine guns. So in the 1930s, as the military intelligence was thinking about this, they came up with the idea of strategic bombing, not tactical bombing. There was no real strategic bombing in World War I because it didn't have the technology. Strategic bombing being, let's fly over the trenches and let's go hit the economic infrastructure of your enemy, in this case, the Germans. Take out the transportation, take out the oil, take out the steel, et cetera, and then they can't wage war, and we won't lose millions of men. That was the theory. And that was developed by what became known as the Bomber Mafia. That was the upper command of the U.S. Army Air Corps at the time, based at Maxwell Air Force Base back in the late 30s. By the way, that Bomber Mafia sobriquet didn't come from any newspaper man or anybody else. It came from the U.S. Army Ground Forces because they were so upset that the Air Force, the Air Corps, was attempting to develop these strategic bombing plans versus the tactical bombing that the ground forces preferred. The tactical bombing being the bombing in support of the ground forces, taking out the bridges, taking out the tanks, taking out the troop concentrations just in front of your own troops, behind their lines. So it was the U.S. Army Ground Forces who nicknamed them the Bomber Mafia, quite a negative term to use. Nevertheless, that was the strategy that came to be, and they hung on to that strategy well into the war. And that's part of the story we're talking here. When the theory of daylight precision bombing hit the reality of the war in Europe in 1942, when the U.S. Army Air Force 8th Bomber Command actually began operations, it ran into all sorts of trouble. It ran into these very intense flak fields, that being the anti-aircraft artillery that the Germans had marshaled thousands and thousands and hundreds of thousands of weapons on the ground. And those weapons were now controlled by radar. So as the planes formed up over England and came across the channel, the radar picked them up, and the anti-aircraft artillery was able to track and follow and concentrate on our air forces. At 42 and 43, about 50% of all the planes we lost was due to the flak, as it was called. The other 50% was due to the German fighter planes. And that's the other development that came about in the early 1940s. And that was the development by the Germans and by us of fighters that were just as fast, if not faster, than the B-17 and the B-24. So, when the reality hit when the theory hit the reality in 1942, this is the other problem they came across, is just the absolute terrible weather. And the Norden bomb sight at that time in 42 and 43 could not see through the clouds. Eventually, we developed radar, ground radar, eventually other technologies that you could bomb through the clouds. But in 42 and 43, if you didn't see the target, you weren't supposed to bomb, and they seldom did. So that's the first point I think I came to learn, and that's the reality that the theory that was developed really did not work in 42 and 43, yet they didn't have any choice if they wanted to have a bomber campaign, and they pressed on and pressed on. So I'm going to stop right there, because I think I need to stop once in a while and just ask, are there any questions or comments that any of, particularly my expert guests, would like to provide?
I'm looking around the Zoom room. I don't see any hands raised or questions in the chat at this point.
Okay.
Greg Yost, actually. Greg Yost, hold on one sec, Greg.
Yes, right. Glenn. One of the things I think that I understand, the British warned the United States that the daylight campaign wasn't going to work, right? I mean, that's why they bombed at night. But the British said, we don't think this is going to work, guys. And the U.S. said, oh, it's going to work. We know what we're doing. Is that a fair assessment of the history of it?
Sure. And the history goes even deeper than that. I mean, the Germans in 1940, after the first 60 days of the Blitz, turned to night bombing instead of daylight bombing for that very reason, that they thought, fewer casualties to bomb at night. The British started their bombing campaign in 1940. It wasn't very effective, nor was it very significant. And they changed over in, I don't know, Colin, maybe help me with this. They changed over in late 41, early 42 to night bombing. Let me unmute Colin.
Actually, it was before then, because on December 18th, 1939, the British sent Wellingtons on a daylight raid to Wilhelmshaven. And my late friends, Wolfgang Fuck and Johannes Steinhoff, shot down every bomber. And that's when they realized that they might need to change their tactics. So the Air Ministry had a meeting, and they said, well, let's start trying to hit them at night. So the British actually started bombing Germany at night before the Blitz ever happened. And that's when they finally did hit Berlin, after Hayo Herman accidentally, bombed London and killed civilians. Then it became a free-for-all.
Yeah. So Greg, we were well warned about this, but because of that bomber mafia mentality, because that theory had been developed, and the weapon systems and the Norden bomb sight, et cetera, we went forward with it. And we're going to talk a little bit here what happened at the Casablanca conference, because the British continued to try to change our minds. And we did at different times. Ira Aker did at different times take several squadrons and/or bomb groups and use them at night with the British as experiments. Okay.
Brad had his hand up.
Yes. Hey, Glenn, did these theories take into account the psychology of the people being bombed? It seemed like there was a lot of technical evaluation of industrial centers, et cetera, but was this a fallacy in the theory, the effect of bombing civilians and other non?
Well, I would say this, that the part of the theory was based on answering a moral question. Should you bomb civilians? And our view, the U.S. view, was no, you should not purposely bomb civilians. Okay. The British come to a very different conclusion, starting with Bomber Harris, Arthur Harris, the head of Bomber Command in 1942, and start just area terror bombing of cities, taking out cities in general. The U.S. attitude was, no, we'll use our Norden bomb sight and daylight precision bombing to attempt to only take out the economic infrastructure, recognizing that some civilians were going to be impacted along the way. But the belief was we could be precise enough to make that at least a minimal amount of damage. Okay, I'll go on here, and then we'll keep coming back to more questions. And the other thing,
Nancy Putnam had her hand up.
Oh, Nancy, go ahead, please.
I was just going to add the one thing you didn't mention, the very real power struggle between the Brits and the Americans. Americans didn't want to give over to Bomber Harris its assets, its men, its machines.
Yes.
And its decision making, which
Yes.
of course then led to, which you're going to get into with Casablanca, where they convinced powers that be that round the clock bombing was the answer. But that was a very real issue.
And that's one of those crossovers, if you will, from World War I, which Marshall was, one of Pershing's key aides during World War I. And what did the Brits want? More so than the French, but the French kind of wanted it. They wanted American manpower divided up at company and battalion level and integrated into British and French units.
Yeah. That's a good perspective, but it definitely was an issue in World War II, and they would not turn it over to the Brits.
Right. Thank you, Nancy. So the other thing I wanted to emphasize, and this may be so well known, it's not worth it, but just these men were flying at 25, 30 odd thousand feet in unpressurized airplanes, open to the environment. And I just can't imagine how cold it was. And we had several of these men try to tell us how cold it was. And I still think for us mere mortals, we could not. So they had to dress in, this fashion, several layers, an electrical suit that sometimes worked. They fought in terrible conditions. This is a waist gunner. You can see he's got this iron apron sort of thing on him, trying to protect himself from shrapnel shots, etc. He's up to his ankles in shots. And the ability to work at this level and take the physical punishment of being at this level for so long, for hours at a time. Cockpit of a B-17. This is where most of the injuries took place, because the Germans eventually, pretty quickly, learned that, you take out the pilot and co-pilot, or you take out the bombardier. This is the view of the bombardier. Then you've taken out the plane, even if it can still fly. So a majority of the injuries and deaths while they were flying took place up front. And Lucky Luckadoo, his story about him, his windshield and his lower level underneath being shot out, and him having to fly the plane with the open air rushing into his feet is just an amazing story. Unfortunately, he's not with us tonight. This next shot, this is the one that always has amazed me, and that's the ball turret gunner. And I just, these men have my deep, deep admiration for doing it. A little bit later, we'll talk about one of the ball turret gunners that we were able to interview, and just can't imagine. So 1942, 43 comes along. This is a map of East Anglia, the area just north of London, closest on the coast, closest to the French coast. And by then, we're in the process of building 40-odd bomber bases. Basically, a bomber base, sort of every 5 or 6 miles. Each bomber base with 3,000 plus men, 235, 240 air crew, the rest of them ground support. Think about that, 3,000 ground support for 235 or so men. This is the air tower that was built in so many different places at each bomber base. This is the air tower at Thorpe Abbotts. Nancy, I'm sure, recognizes that. It's now a museum. And this is the air tower that we're going to be visiting in September, turned into a museum for the 100th Bomb Group. Really looking forward to that. And if you watch Masters of the Air, you saw the scenes where those on the ground would come out to the air towers. So finally, the bombing campaign gets started. The first mission is August 17th, 1942, flown by this man, who everybody should recognize, Captain Paul Tibbets. Our Acre was actually on this mission as well, but it was Paul Tibbets who was the lead commander in 12 B-17s. And they fly to I think a railroad marshalling yard in France. It's a surprise bombing raid. There's no German opposition, no flak, no fighter planes. They take out the marshalling yard pretty well. And everybody says, oh, that was great. That was great. See, it works. Daylight precision bombing works. This is going to work. We just need more planes. Well, they added more planes, 3 or 4 bomb groups finally by sort of late 42. But the missions got tougher because now the Germans were expecting them. And the Germans began to put in place all that anti-aircraft. The Germans began to put in place their own fighter bases to challenge them. Along comes this man, one of my favorite commanders for during World War II, probably the best bomber group commander of the war, and that's Colonel Curtis LeMay at this point. He eventually becomes a general, of course. Very hard, driven man, but incredibly logical and incredibly rational. And he comes up with what became standard practice, and that's the initial point. Before he came up with this for his bomb group in the latter part of 1942, the planes would zig and zag, as Lucky put it, as they got close to the target, in this case, Nantes in southern France or the coast of France. They would try to avoid the flak because it's sort of natural thing. If someone's shooting at you, you try to avoid it. He came up with the theory that you could do just as well. The odds were just as good of you making it through that flak field and hitting the target if everybody stayed on a steady course. And in fact, that proved correct, and they got better results, right? They also came up with oops, I can't move the slides here. It also came up with the theory and then put into practice by first his bomber group and then eventually the whole 8th Air Force of the combat box, so that you could concentrate these planes in as tight a groupings as possible in order to use the defensive powers of the B-17, which you see here in this illustration, to protect the bomber stream, to protect the bomber group. The tighter they were, the better these 12 different 50 caliber machine guns on this plane could defend itself. And I just want to go back to Curtis LeMay because we have somebody here, Colin Heaton, who knew Curtis LeMay and interviewed him. Give us a couple tidbits on Curtis LeMay, Colin, if you would.
Well, the best things he said I can't say on public airways, but and a lot of it got cut out of my book by the editor. They ran it by the lawyers, and they said they didn't think they could publish the language. But Curtis LeMay was Patton with an airplane. That's the way I describe him. He was absolutely dedicated, ruthless, and wanted to win the war. And if people who've read his interview in my book, Above the Right, his personality just comes right the hell out. And he carried that same get it done and kill them all mentality when he went to bomb Japan. So, yeah, he was a warrior.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. And but you know, the same and just as when he took over the what was it, the 20th Bomber Command with the B-29s, incredibly practical, rational thinker. Just one of the things I read on was your book or another book, and I've actually used this technique in my own personal life. When he went to bed and he couldn't sleep, and I think his father was an auto mechanic in Columbus, as I recall. What he would do is he would take apart a V8 engine and then put it back together in his own mind. That's a way to get himself to sleep, which I just found hilarious and practical, as a matter of fact. Okay, so that's Curtis LeMay. The next thing I wanted to mention, and this seems out of place, but it's really not, and that's Operation Torch in North Africa in November of 1942, the invasion of North Africa. Why is this important? Mostly because this took away dramatic amount of resources from the 8th Air Force. This was never a thought by the original, strategy of the 8th Air Force in early 1942. This only came about, it was only finally decided in June, July of 1942 that we're going to invade North Africa. When we do, it becomes, of course, the North African campaign, and it draws a significant amount of resources from the 8th Air Force. Fewer, many bomber groups going to North Africa instead of England. And that made a difference, as you'll see. These two men, well recognized, FDR and Churchill, meet at Casablanca in January of 1943 for the first Allied War Conference. Just the two of them, no Joseph Stalin. And among the many things that they decide is that they decide to continue the bombing by the 8th during the day. And the man that comes down and convinces him of that, and he's called there by Hap Arnold, was one Ira Eaker, who was the commander of the 8th Air Force at that time. And Ira Eaker meets with Churchill. He doesn't meet with FDR. He meets with Churchill and Hap Arnold. And Ira Eaker had a 2-page paper. There was no sort of deep, analysis, no, regression analysis, nothing like that, about why it made sense to continue daylight bombing. And the 2 or 3 points he made, one was our equipment, our planes, our training, our men were all trained for daylight bombing, that it would take a considerable amount of time and effort to change them to night bombing and make them effective. The other, the one that really caught Churchill's attention is, look, if we bomb during the day and the RAF bombs at night, it'll be round-the-clock bombing. And Churchill picks up on this, and like Churchill, he turns that phrase, and he really likes it, and it turns into this phrase. I can't get it exactly, but I'll paraphrase it. Great, we'll bomb the buggers day and night, And that's how, at that time, the pressure that was on the 8th Air Force to bomb at night was taken off. And that was the birth of what became known as the Combined Bomber Offensive, or also known as Operation Point Blank. And that was in January of 1943. Up to that moment in time, we had not bombed, we, the 8th Air Force, had not bombed into Germany. We had only bombed closer in targets, France, Belgium, I suppose, Norway, the sub-pens, that sort of thing, okay? So very important point here now is January of 1943 and the rest of 1943, which I'm going to get into, but I'm going to stop again to see if there's any comments or questions that anybody would like to ask.
A lot of chats here. If anyone wants to flip over, a lot of good stuff from Greg and Colin. Steve, no questions, but a lot of chatter.
Okay, great. I just want to be sure, this is a little different program. Usually I'm interviewing other people, right? And in this case, I'm trying my best to deliver a presentation that is not an outright lecture. I spent too many years in classrooms being lectured to, and despise the idea that just a lecture. I love these interactive discussions.
Carol did just ask, did LeMay even dislike Ike?
That's Colin. I don't think the two ever really interacted, because by the time Ike shows up in early 1944, LeMay is close to being gone.
He knew Ike, and he told me a really good story about that was pretty much cut out of the book as usual. But he told me a good story about how he and Aker and a couple of other guys were talking about Ike and his driver. And they said, well, don't worry about Ike and his love interest. She's helping Ike win the war for us. And but no, he respected Ike. He did. He respected Marshall. He respected almost everybody, even a few West Pointers, which he normally loathed. But there were some officers that he absolutely detested. He didn't like MacArthur at all. Really, I mean, he didn't see much value in his mindset, which was taken out of the book. But yeah, but LeMay was very hardcore. He liked you. There was no gray area. He either liked you or he didn't like you.
Yeah. There's a great story, which I don't want to go into now. If we have time at the end, I'd like to talk about Curtis LeMay and General Joseph Vinegar Stilwell. And it was in the book, The Bomber Mafia. Then I just find it incredibly revealing, but we'll save that for later. So 1943, January 27th, the first 8th Air Force raid into to penetrate Germany occurs to Wilhelmshaven. Not a particularly problematic raid. They hit the sub pens, I think, the Navy yards. It's well done. And this begins the 8th Air Force effort to bomb deep into Germany. This also begins eventually the incredibly high casualty rate that comes about. Mission to Bremen, May 21st, 98 bombers, 15 shot down. 15 times 10, that's 150 men lost, casualties. Not all killed, many taken prisoner of war, many killed. Mission to Bremen, June 13th, 151 bombers, 26 lost. Even the bombers that made it back to England, you can see this one, what kind of condition they're in. Many of these bombers that made it back to England had men killed in action on board and many, many injured men on board. Even though they may have only lost, 15 or 20 bombers shot down, many of these bombers came back without that were so badly damaged they could not return to service. Many of them were repaired by this incredible ground crew that we developed over time. This is about the time we begin to understand, and certainly the B-17 bomb crews understood, that this plane, the P-47, Ed, as much as you love this plane and as great an airplane as it was, this was the only airplane we had. We had P-38s as well. That's another story, but equally as inadequate to protect the bombers all the way into Germany. The P-47s at this time could get maybe to the German border. And there's many, many cases, many, many mission stories where the bomber stream hits the German border. The P-47s, because they just lacked the range, had to turn back. And that's when the German Luftwaffe, the German fighters, the 109s and the 190s began to attack in earnest in the scores and hundreds of fighters trying to take down and actually taking down many of our bombers. Okay. And this is part of the story that we're going to get into here. Okay. Just another shot of another B-17 wrecked on landing. This begins the incredible number of great stories that we've gotten into, and we can get into it more again tonight if you like, about the B-17 versus the B-24. All I will tell you, after listening to as many B-17 and 24 pilots and crewmen as I have, if I had the choice, I'd be on a B-17. If I had the choice, I wouldn't have been there, but many did not have that choice. The missions continue, and the number of our bombers continue to grow, but the casualty rate continues to grow. Hanover, July 26, 232 bombers from the 8th Air Force sent. Oops, sorry here. Sent 24 lost. The intensity picks up, the number of bombers pick up. There's the famous August 17th mission to Regensburg and Schweinfurt. that's depicted so well. I'm sorry for this bouncing. I'm not quite sure how to stop it. So I don't want to go to the next slide yet. 376 bombers sent, 60 lost. Right. And then we get to what the airmen, and particularly the 100th Bomb Group, called Black Week. And that was a week in October. October 8th, mission to Germany, 33 bombers lost. October 9th, Germany, 28 bombers lost. The famous mission to Bremen, 31 bombers lost on October 10th. Then the famous mission to Schweinfurt, again on October 14th, 60 bombers lost. This is the crew of Rosie Rosenthal's crew, Rosie Riveters, 100th Bomb Group. This is the mission to Munster, where 13 of the 100th Bomb Group planes went to Munster. By that time, they were so depleted, they could only put up 13 planes. And Rosie's crew was the only one to make it back. Again, depicted so dramatically in the Masters of the Air. November, we lose 137 planes. December, we lose 201 planes. At this point, and this is what we were talking about, how we almost lost the air war. We certainly were not winning the air war at this point. And you could argue we were losing it at this point. That as somebody else put it to me, our attrition rate was so high, we just weren't sure we could keep putting in the number of bombers and the number of bomber crews over and over and over again. The other thing was that, were we really hurting the German industrial infrastructure? I think it was you, Colin, who perhaps said to me one time, you know, the rate of destruction that the bomber force was achieving was not as great as the rate of reconstruction that the Germans were able to achieve. And the net result was we weren't really hurting the German economy at this point. Here and there, sure, we took out some ball bearing plants, we took out this or that, but they were able to recover very, very quickly. So that's where we are in the fall of 1943, with some real big question marks as to what was going to happen next. And I'm going to stop the share for a moment. Colin, Nancy, you know the 100th Bomb Group so well. Where was the 100th Bomb Group's mentality in November, December of 1943?
It was low morale. That was right when my father joined, right the day after Munster. And they did not stand down, but weather did not permit missions for a few weeks, late October. And so the first big mission after Munster that they did was November 3rd. And then it was pretty steady through November. But it was the lack of fighter support, obviously. And then finally, just as the fighters began to arrive, am I jumping ahead, Jimmy Doolittle? You can talk about the change in leadership.
I'm going to get to that in about 5 minutes.
I'll stop. Yeah. So,
but safe to say the morale at this point, not just in the 100th, but in all of the Air Force was, I mean, after all, these men are they never turned back once. That's what always impressed me. They never turned back once. Despite the fact that they get in that plane and they know the odds of them coming back are 50-50 at best on any one mission. I mean, there were mission rates where there was 30-35% attrition.
Right. I think I'll just say one thing, and then we can get back to it depending on what you do with Doolittle, because that's sort of one of my great interests. So you started this whole thing with the issue of leadership, and it is the leadership within each squadron, within each group. LeMay clearly was by far the best, the highest regarded. And but my father was fortunate, even with the problems within the 100th and the depletion, of being in a squadron with a phenomenal leader, Colonel Bennett, John Bennett, Cowboy Roan. They didn't make 349 Squadron isn't in Masters, but that's the famous crew that came back from Regensburg with an ass, with a miniature donkey.
Oh yeah.
By Mo. And my father knew Mo. Mo was still there when he got there. And the leadership was phenomenal at the squadron level. And that is how my father learned and to be a pilot, be a combat pilot.
Yeah.
And I think I bet other groups would comment the same, is that it really came down to those levels. And then it was the change with Doolittle and the arrival of the fighters.
Yeah, which is the next part I'm going to get into.
Right.
But I just wanted to draw the picture that at this point in late 43, it's a very grim picture.
Oh, yeah.
42 and 43, the statistic that is telling is this: 77% of all the 8th Air Force bomber crews that flew in 42 and 43 were casualties.
Yep.
77%.
Yep.
Right. There's that old military adage. You hear a lot of combat veterans say that, when you're in formation, you're about to go to a combat area. Look to your left, look to your right. Only one of you coming back.
Exactly.
In this case, it was only 1 out of 4 that were coming back.
Yeah.
And how these men did that day after day after day is unfathomable to me. Unfathomable. So let's continue the story unless there's other questions. Oh, I see a hand up. Doug Doerr, let me ask you to unmute.
You hear me?
Yes, Doug.
Yeah, that book I was helping the author with on Mission 115 on what happened with everybody. That was the famous Schweinfurt mission. And going through some of the aborts that they had. 1st Bombardment Division had 42 aborts on that one mission. The 3rd Division had 33. 2nd Division, the B-24s, they're added in here, but they were on a diversionary mission and couldn't form up, and they had 42. A total of 117 aborts out of all the aircraft that participated in that mission. And a lot of the reasons were crew failure. Pilot, I've had enough, or gunners, I had enough, and they returned, and no record of what happened to those people. But higher headquarters was beginning to really worry about that because the abort rates continued to go up, and Schweinfurt was probably the turning point on that.
Yeah, and I'm going to get into the story of Jimmy Doolittle here in a second to illustrate that. Not Jimmy Doolittle, Jimmy Stewart. Jimmy Stewart. Okay, let me push on here. So we all know the story of Lucky Luckadoo. This book that Kevin Maurer wrote with Lucky a couple of years ago, which was the first time we interviewed Lucky, is just an incredibly well done book. Lucky Luckadoo still with us, 102 years old. We have the interview of Lucky. I don't think I'm going to play it because it goes on for about 10 minutes, and I think most of you have heard it. And if you haven't heard it, just go to the Veterans Breakfast Club website, where he responds to lots of questions that we ask him. Lucky Luckadoo, and Nancy, maybe you can help me with this too. I thought Lucky Luckadoo was a replacement co-pilot early on into Hundred's tenure. He was not part of the original cadre of men. Is that right or wrong? Can we unmute Nancy, Sean? I can't do it. I don't have it up.
But I'm looking for Nancy. There you are, Nancy.
Nancy?
Okay, can you hear me now? Okay. No, he was original cadre. He came out of the pilot class 43B, I want to say. All of them all those pilots were certified, not 4-engine bomber trained.
Right.
And they were dropped in as co-pilots. That is one of his fiercest stories and chapters. It's an entire chapter in the book.
You can still hear his bitterness and resentment
Yes,
about that
but
today.
he doesn't understand, and he's always looking for answers as to why it happened only in the 100th. And we have a really great group here. Every one of us has read dozens, if not hundreds of books. And you know what? A lot of decisions were never documented and are never understood. It was just one of those, hey, it didn't work. We're not doing it again. Yeah. No, he did go over as an original air crew, and joined right away at the start. And of 36, this is the number he would give you again. Of 36 in his class, only 4 survived 25 missions.
Yeah, I've heard him say.
And he was one of them.
Yeah. If you haven't read his book, read the book. It's one of the best. One of the best. And as I said, episode now. Jimmy Stewart. This is another great book written by Robert Mattson. I was hoping Robert would be on tonight. I invited him. Local Pittsburgh guy. Jimmy Stewart in the Fight for Europe. I've really come to deeply respect Jimmy Stewart, and this picture tells you so much, right? He didn't have to even go to war, but he fought to go to war. He had a single-engine pilot license when he was a Hollywood star. He came from a military family. His father fought in World War I, his grandfather in the Civil War. From Indiana, Pennsylvania, not too far from here, we're proud to say. And he finally makes it to England in 1943 in a B-24 bomber squadron, originally trained in B-17s, switched to 24s so he could get to England. And he ends up flying, I think in total 17, 18 missions, but originally he flies 11 missions, and he actually then has to take a break and can go to one of the flak farms. Now think, this is a picture. This is Jimmy in 1942 on the left, and this is him 2.5 years later in 1945. Look at the difference. And this man flew these missions when he's 35, 36 years old. Most of these B-17 and B-24 pilots were 21, 22, 23. If you were 25, 28, you were called pops. And so it just was so much more difficult for him to take that, not necessarily the pressure of combat, but the physical pressure of flying a plane at 35,000 feet in 25 or 35 below. But he comes back and he becomes a squadron commander, and he stays in England for the whole war. At the end of the war, he actually becomes a bomber group commander. And you just see the toll that it took on him. And going back to what Doug had to say, obviously, this wasn't just Jimmy Stewart who took this kind of punishment. It was all these men who took this kind of punishment. And it's surprising that more of them didn't suffer more, right? This is Harry Crosby right here in the middle. Harry Crosby's featured in the Masters of the Air TV series. He also wrote this book, which I've now read 2 or 3 times in the past couple of months, On a Wing and a Prayer. And I highly recommend this book. This book came out in the 1990s. And when you read this and read Don Miller's Masters of the Air, I would say as much of the series, the TV series Masters of the Air, is taken from Harry's book as is taken from Don Miller's book. Don, excellent book, just had the better title, if you will. And Harry became a PhD writing teacher in the Ivy Leagues. So this book is just full of information and knowledge. And in fact, we're going to go on and do a couple of more things with Rebecca Hutchinson, who is Harry's youngest daughter, and David Faley, who's the 100th Bomber Group historian. And that's coming up soon, Nancy. I'll be in touch with you about that. And this is, of course, Rosie Rosenthal. We interviewed Sam Rosenthal, his grandson, who played an acting part in Masters of the Air TV series. If you don't know Rosie's story, you should know it. It's in the Masters of the Air book. It's in Harry Crosby's book. This man volunteered for a second tour, 54 missions, shot down twice. Just an incredible man with an incredible story. And I think, Nancy, your father knew him very well during the war, right? Didn't they train together? Oh, I think we got to unmute Nancy again.
Gotcha, Nancy.
Yep. Sorry, I put that in just because I have other stuff going on in the background, so I don't want to interfere with the show. Yeah, no, my dad was, they were close friends. They roomed together. They were assigned together, Putnam Rosenthal. The logic of the Army was all alphabetical. Starting December 26, 1941, they were together, never separated until they arrived in England. And then they were sent to different bases. Rosie went straight to the 100th. My dad went to the 94th and then was reassigned to the 100th after Munster when they needed replacement crews. Yeah, very close.
And if you haven't watched the series, watch it. The man who plays Rosie Rosenthal, I think, steals the show. I mean,
Nate Mann is great. Rosie, by the way, if you don't mind me correcting, he flew 52 missions.
52. Fine. Thank you. His last mission being shot down over Russian lines as he approached Russian lines just beyond Berlin.
Yeah, he was shot down over Berlin, and most of the guys who bailed out of his plane were captured. Yeah. He stayed with the plane to get the guys out and then went down just in the middle of the battle of the Russians.
Yeah. Just an incredible character, incredible man. Wings of War. Now we're going to get into the story of the P-51, which I think is one of the central stories of 1943, if not the central story. And we had David and Margaret White early on in this series about this book they wrote called The Wings of War, the World War II fighter plane that saved the Allies and the believers that made it fly. Highly recommend this book. We've had a couple of our veterans in the Veterans Breakfast Club read it, World War II veterans, and they read it and they're angry that this fighter plane was not introduced earlier, which it could have been. This is it in 1941 in its prototype model built in California. The plane is underpowered a bit. It's got a U.S. engine in it of some kind. I can't remember which one. And it flies very well. It's very smooth. It's very aerodynamic, but it didn't have the power that it should have. And it was actually developed for the RAF. The RAF uses it as reconnaissance plane. This man, Lieutenant Colonel Tommy Hitchcock, is just a fascinating study, a fascinating character in this book. And there's a book, just a bio just about him I read a long time ago. World War I fighter ace, Wall Street investment banker, sort of New York aristocrat. War comes along. He wants to become a fighter pilot again. He's turned down because he's 48, 50 years old. And he becomes the Air Force liaison at the U.S. Embassy in London. And he becomes one of the key men to fight for the P-51 to be brought into the U.S. Army Air Force. And this is in early 1942, because in 1942, the RAF has the idea of matching that P-51 fighter plane with this Rolls-Royce Allison engine, which is just an incredibly powerful engine. And this engine turns that plane into the P-51 that we think of today, with an incredible climb rate, an incredible turning ability, incredible speed, et cetera, okay? We could have had this in the air in mid-1943 with our bomber forces, but we hesitate. Why? Because the upper command of the Air Force at that time, the U.S. Army Air Force, still thought that we could get through without fighters, despite what they were seeing in terms of casualty rates right in front of them. Finally, in late 1943, this man on your left, Colonel Donald Blakesley, who was one of the premier fighter pilots of the U.S. Army Air Force at that time, I think flying P-47s. And
Glenn,
leading.
Sorry to interrupt. I'm still seeing the engine. Okay, wait, now it just switched. Okay.
Yeah. Seeing just an ace, I think several times over. He is asked to fly the P-51, which he does. And he comes away from that experimental flight saying, what in the world are we doing? Why is this plane not in the 8th Air Force Fighter Command? And to the right was his boss, General William Kepper, who was in charge of fighter command for the 8th Air Force. Finally, we put the plane into the 8th Air Force fighter command in late 1943 and early 1944. And this becomes the, race car fighter plane of the war. Before I get to Jimmy Doolittle, I'm going to stop. And Colin, didn't you interview Blakesley? Do I recall that right?
I knew Don very well. Yeah.
So any anecdotes you can tell us about his experience with the P-51?
Yeah, he flew the first shuttle mission to Russia, escorting bombers rather than turn around on the return mission. The bombers and the fighters would fly to Russia, refuel, rearm, and then fly back for another hit, which confused Luftwaffe commanders on the ground. Even Adolf Galland said it was a brilliant move. But Blakesley flew back and came to see Jimmy Doolittle when he was, of course, 8th Air Force commander. His secretary says, "Colonel Blakesley, may I help you?" And he goes, "Shut up." I'm going to see the general. He goes, "Well, you have an appointment?" And he goes, "Yeah, it's in my shoe." So he kicks the door open, walks in, Doolittle is sitting there. And Jimmy told me the story. And he says, Blakesley comes walking and says, "Those son of a bitches, those damned Russians, they pulled a gun on me when I landed." And they said, "Oh, I'm gonna kill some damn body," So he was really upset with the Russians. But Blakesley had flown with the British before. We actually got involved in the war with our own fighters. He was flying Spitfires, and his unit became the 4th Fighter Group.
Yeah.
The Eagle Squadron.
Yeah, the Eagle Squadron.
Yeah. Okay. So the point of all this is this P-51 introduced in late 43, 44, had it not been for, let's call it the military bureaucracy, the logistical command of the U.S. Army Air Force, the thought process, frankly, of Hap Arnold and the men around him, this airplane could have been in service mid-1943, if not a couple months earlier. And it cost us an awful lot of men, an awful lot of planes, and sort of in my mind, and this is something I didn't understand until the last few months, I think almost unpardonable that we put those bomber crews through the kind of torture that we did when the answer was right there in front of our nose. Maybe that's kind of strong, but that's just the way I've come to believe. And if you read that book and look at the research the Whites did, I think you'd come to the same conclusion. Okay, let's move on here. And
Would you like to take a station break real quick, Glenn?
Oh, yeah. I forgot about that. Thank you.
Not a problem. I'll pop over real quick and share my screen. And we just like to thank our sponsors, tobacco-free Adagio Health, and supporting us for some time now. We appreciate the support of VBC. They are dedicated to preventing and reducing tobacco use, educating people about tobacco hazards, and advocating for healthier places to live, work, and play. You can find out everything there is to know about tobacco-free. Excuse me. That's not from smoking. I just had a frog in my throat. On their website, tobaccofree.adagiohealth.org. You can also call their popular quit line, 1-800-QUIT-NOW. And we would also like to thank UPMC for Life. They can help you make sense of Medicare, get the answers and information you need, such as how to choose the Medicare Advantage plan that's right for you. UPMC for Life has plans designed for veterans by veterans that can save you money and get you more benefits. You can view all your plan options by going to upmchealthplan.com/Medicare. This is our new magazine. It has gone to the printer. There was a delay getting it to the printer, but this hopefully will be hitting mailboxes maybe next week. Let's hope. As it would be nice as an extra bookend to tonight's program, and looking forward to everyone's review of the magazine. And if you are new to us, this is a free quarterly magazine. If you don't get it, it's because we don't have your address. Just send us an email. We're happy to get you out a copy. And if anybody here would like to distribute more than just one copy, maybe get 25, 50, 100 maybe, and say, hey, I'm going to drop these off wherever I can to get the word out about VBC. We would love to send you a box. Please let us know, and we will get that in the mail to you. I will put a link to the survey into the chat. We keep following this. Just let us know. Let us know what you're thinking of the programs. It helps us greatly so that we can help provide the best programs possible for you all. And so I will put that link into the chat. It takes about 2 minutes to fill it out. And upcoming VBC programs next Monday, or this coming Monday, I should say, we have War and Transgenerational Trauma. Carl, you see that last name. I didn't know how to pronounce it until I got into his what's called a graphic memoir, Shakatano. Carl is going to be joining us station and very excited by it. I read his graphic memoir. He is a comic book artist, decided to write this memoir about his dad's experiences in Vietnam and his relationship with his father. It reads like a movie. Look it up. It's incredible. The Heart That Fed. I had a blast reading it. It's visually stunning, composed beautifully by him. He writes it and is the artist for it. It's about 250, 300 pages, and it flies by. I highly recommend it personally, and I can't wait for you all to meet Carl next week for this conversation. Then I believe we are off on Thursday night next week. Is that correct, Glenn?
That's correct. No GGL next Thursday. That's correct.
No GGL next Thursday. So we're jumping to the following Monday, where we will have back on Brian Mora. He wrote a follow-up to his Able Archer's book called The Righteous Arrows right here. Excited to have him back on because in the meantime, since he was on last time, he appeared on the Netflix series the Cold War and the Bomb, Turning Point, which I watched that series and was really blown away by the series. It was fantastic. I highly recommend that on Netflix. If you don't know about, look it up. He appears in episode 5. It's all about the Cold War, and he makes an appearance. We're going to talk with him not only about that appearance as well as his book, The Righteous Arrows. Then we'll be back with Glenn the following Thursday for the U.S. Army at Guadalcanal. So looking forward to upcoming VBC programs. So thank you all for listening. Back to you, Glenn.
Yeah, that U.S. Army at Guadalcanal will be the first in a whole series of 80th anniversary stories about events that occurred 80 years ago. So that should be interesting. Okay, let me try to bring this to a conclusion. And let me get into the PowerPoint again. So, as Nancy has been mentioning, the man that comes and makes the strategic difference, if I can get my pointer to work, is this guy, one of my favorites of World War II, and that's General Doolittle, famous Doolittle Raiders. Doolittle, after winning the Congressional Medal of Honor and via the Doolittle Raid, becomes the commander of the air forces in the Mediterranean under Eisenhower. Eisenhower and him get along famously well, and he's one of the commanders that Eisenhower brings with him in January of 1944 to England to prepare for the invasion of Normandy. And the key point here that we were pointing towards with Nancy Putman is early on in the first week of his tenure, he's at the Fighter Command headquarters with that General Kepner. And sorry?
I didn't say. I hope you're going to do the quote. It's great.
Well, Nancy, I'm going to let you do the quote because I was going to paraphrase it. Do you have the exact quote?
I do. In preparation, I looked it up so I wouldn't have to paraphrase it. He goes, "You're exactly right." He goes into Kepner's 8th Fighter Command office, sees the sign on the wall, which states exactly the first duty of the 8th Air Force fighters is to bring the bombers back alive. And they have a, shall we say, direct conversation about who the hell put that up there and take it down. You are here forward to replace it with the first duty of the 8th Air Force fighters is to destroy German fighters. And Colin can say it worked. It really ticked off the bomber crews. Here they had finally gotten fighter support, and in their view, they were just stuck up there in the air as bait, and the fighters were pulled away. But in retrospect, most of them understood over time that was the key to turning the tide of the war, the air war. And again, Colin's the expert in this, but the fighters were now unleashed to do what they do, is pursuit and basically go on offense. They took out the fighters wherever they found them in the air, on the ground. They tried to keep the fighters away from the bombers. And that was the change in strategy.
And it was men like this. This is Bud Anderson, who we interviewed 4 years ago when he was a mere 98 years old.
Yeah.
Fortunately, Bud passed away just a month or two ago at 100.
Yeah, not just recently.
Just recently passed away, and I'm sorry again, this thing just keeps jumping. Triple Ace, 19, 20 years old when they unleashed him in a P-51 Mustang, and he's the type of fighter pilot that is still around today. You know, young men, incredibly brave, but incredibly young, don't believe they could ever die, incredibly gifted. They're really warrior athletes. And him and his colleagues are the ones, along with some others I'm going to mention in a little bit, that shot down the Luftwaffe. And of course, that P-51 was, I don't know, Colin, would you say superior to the 190?
No, it wasn't. It was in range, and it was equal in firepower, and it was as good in roll rate, but and just as good, if not better, in climbing from the A series 190s. Diving, it was the 190 was better, but they were pretty evenly matched. I mean, if any two aircraft in World War II could be, say, evenly matched, if you look at all the components, the P-51D and the FW-190 A series were really perfectly matched that way.
Yeah. But I think the difference becomes the training and the capability of our fighter pilots versus the German fighter pilots who didn't have enough fuel to train. And so many of the veterans had been shot down, replaced by much younger, very lowly trained pilots.
Right. Well, you have to understand, Germany, when Germany entered World War II, throughout the entire war, they trained 125,000 pilots. Only 27,500 and something were fighter pilots, and only 2,500 survived the war. So that tells you something.
Yeah.
Yeah, and along the same lines, Glenn, if you don't mind me interjecting, at the same time that the Luftwaffe was losing their experienced pilots, the 8th Air Force, another strategic, important decision Jimmy Doolittle made that really ticked off the bomber pilots. He upped their mission requirement from 25 to 30.
Right.
3 months later, upped it again to 35, because he realized that it took a minimum of 10, 11, 12-ish missions to gain combat experience and be effective. If you survived those missions, then you were in a position to be more effective and to train newer crews. And he wanted to keep the experience around. So at the same time that he unleashes the P-51s to go directly at the Luftwaffe, he keeps the experienced bomber air crews.
The other element, and I'm going to put up here, Steve, are you still with us, Steve? Steve Snyder, if you could unmute him for us, Colin, I'd appreciate it.
I got him.
Okay. Hi, Steve. What I was going to get into is the other element is the number of bombers and the number of crews by late 43 into 44 begins to multiply dramatically. And you know, instead of putting up 250, 300 bombers, we're putting up 700, 800, and eventually 1,000 bombers, which obviously makes a huge difference. And your father was came to England at what time frame, Steve?
He was one of the replacement crews after second Schweinfurt on October 14th, and my dad and his crew arrived at Third Line, the 306 bomb group, on October 21st, 43.
Great. And he shot down in the spring of 44?
February 8th of 44.
Great, 44. And I think, is this him in the lower left?
Yes.
Thought so, yeah.
He was the first pilot.
Yeah. We had Steve on a couple of years ago. He wrote this book, Shot Down. Forgive me for not putting it in quotes. Highly recommend this book. It's a story of Steve's father, who uniquely is shot down and then is not captured, but he joins the French resistance. Do I have that right, Steve?
Yes, he was missing in action for 7 months, but he evaded capture. He was hidden by many Belgian people for several months, and then finally he got tired of hiding. He heard that word came that the Allies had landed at Normandy, so he decided to get back in the fight rather than stay hidden and waiting for the U.S. armies to come up through France after D-Day. He felt it was his duty to get back into the fight. Unlike most airmen, he went into the Army for a year, so he had a year's worth of infantry training and knew how to fight on the ground. So he joined a unit of the French resistance, fought with them for a couple of months, attacking German convoys.
And I didn't find the picture, but there's a picture that Steve has of his father jumping out of a Jeep with, I think, a rifle in his hand, the Jeep full of French resistance fighters. And it's one of the best photos of World War II airmen, fighting in the resistance I've ever seen.
Yeah, a lot of the Belgian people that helped my dad sent him pictures after the war that they took with my dad, and other Belgian historians sent me a lot of pictures that were taken during the war by Belgian people. So they're pretty cool pictures.
Yeah. So just to continue on here, so another veteran that we've interviewed many times, he's not on the program tonight. He often is, like Ed is, Joe Peterburs. P-51 pilot, late 44, early 45. This is a dramatic painting of him shooting down a 262 that had just shot down two B-17s. Came up from behind it and shot it down. And then 10 or 15 minutes later, this is Joe bailing out of his P-51, as I recall, just south of Berlin. He was actually shot down by ground fire. And the story that goes on from there, which I'm not going to repeat now just because of the time, is unbelievable. He's captured, spends a few days in a POW camp with some of his colleagues, escapes, ends up fighting with a Russian tank battalion for a couple of weeks before the U.S. Army finally corrals him. It's unfortunate Joe is with us tonight. Ed Cottrell is. Ed, hopefully we can unmute you. Ed, as I mentioned before, was a P-47 pilot. And what I always found fascinating about Ed's story is that he flew for the 9th Air Force, not the 8th Air Force or the 15th, but the 9th Air Force, which was the tactical Air Force. And he flew all his missions out of European bases. Ed, are you with us?
I think I am.
I think you are. I know you're with us.
Good.
And Ed, this is the mission
I was in Europe throughout all my missions.
On the continent. Yeah. And this was the kind of mission you flew, right?
Right. We did, out of my 65 missions, I only flew one escort mission, and that was only out part way again because we didn't have fuel to go any further. And so then when the 51s came in, we became tactical fire, and that's where the 47 belonged. I mean, it was devastating to people on the ground, much better than it was in the fighting combat against the Luftwaffe.
Right. And this is Ed holding a piece of his airplane up after a mission. I think you do remember this, don't you, Ed?
The flak, the one thing that all P-47 pilots absolutely worried was flak, and every mission was going through flak, and almost every mission we flew came home with ground fire bullet holes in the plane. I know on one mission I flew over Julik, I came home back with 38 bullet holes in the plane and never knew the plane had been hit.
It really was a flying tank sort of plane.
It sure was.
Well, thank you, Ed. Thank you for being with us tonight.
My honor.
Coming with us to England in September. And the ultimate story is we defeat the Luftwaffe and we enable this landing to take place on June 6, 1944, with minimal interference, not no interference, but very minimal, no really effective interference from the German Luftwaffe because we shot it down. And for the balance of the war, we just keep putting thousands of planes in the air. A couple other points, last points. We didn't do it alone, or the 8th Air Force and the 9th Air Force didn't do it alone. The 15th Air Force was based at Foggia in southern Italy. B-17s, N-24s, a lot of 24s. This is where the Tuskegee Airmen were located, and this is our friend Harry Stewart, who we've interviewed a couple of times. Harry will be 100 years old on July 4th of this year. Harry was 18, 19 years old when he went into the Tuskegee Airmen, arrived in Foggia, Italy in, I think, January of 45. In, I believe this is March of 1945, he shoots down three German fighters in one mission, which in itself was fantastic. But also at that time, there just weren't very many German planes in the air. We've interviewed Harry twice. And again, if you want to find that interview, look for it. The last part I want to get into is the POW story. And unfortunately, Marilyn Walton could not be with us tonight. She is just a walking encyclopedia, especially on Stalag Luft 3. And she brought many, many of her friends to us that we were able to interview. One that she helped us with was, I thought this was something I learned an awful lot from, Les Schrenk, still alive, sergeant in the 327th Bombers Squadron, 92nd Bomb Group. Les shot down over Denmark. Les had been this is one of those ball turret gunners. You just can't believe that people did this, that they fit into that thing. He's still alive, 102. We had him on 3 months ago. And what I learned in that was that the enlisted men that were shot down and became POWs were treated very differently than the officers. You see this map. They all at first went to Dulag, where they were interrogated for several days. But then they were split up, and the famous Stalag Luft 3 was here, where we had many stories. Nancy's father was put in Stalag Luft 1, which was also an officer POW camp.
Right.
But Les was put up here almost on the border of Lithuania in a enlisted men's camp. And the conditions there were much, much different, much more harsh, much more difficult than the officers had. Not that the officers had it easy, but I learned a great deal from Les about how poorly the enlisted men were treated by the Germans. Nancy, were you going to say something?
Yeah, it's one of the things that I've been inundated with questions upon with people within our membership group who didn't appreciate the differences between camps, and we've been trying to educate people. Stalag Luft 3, the depiction of it, and Marilyn's input was wonderful by all reports. It was what they needed for their production. The Dulag Luft scenes, the Stalag Luft 3 scenes, Moosburg, incredibly accurate and well done, but it does not deal at all with the different, and they couldn't, there wasn't enough time or money. Stalag Luft 1 was very different than Luft 3, just by virtue of its location. Yeah. And all the enlisted men's camps were way worse than both Luft and 1. Yeah. A lot of abuse, way worse conditions in the camps, and they were all marched earlier than Luft 3. So you looked at what in your diagram here, 4 and 6. Yeah. A bunch of them ended up at Luft 1 in January, February of 45. My father described just the decrepit condition, very, very much like concentration camp descriptions. And some of the other camps, you haven't circled them there. There are a bunch of them, ended up down obviously in Moosburg. Yeah. Yeah. And that's, depicted. Yeah, it's really very, very different.
For me personally, going into this 6 months ago, this is the area where I learned more. I guess it just pointed out my lack of knowledge, and that was the POW experience. There are a couple of stories that I found just fascinating that Marilyn brought to us. One was this finding Sconiers. This is Ewart Sconiers, a pilot, shot down in 43, I believe. He was one of the POWs who died in captivity. And surprisingly few died in captivity in Germany, right? And the story of finding his remains is in this documentary, Finding Sconiers, which I've watched a couple of times now. We had his, I'm sorry, I'm gonna forget, was it his daughter or his daughter? His daughter on, and what she and Marilyn did to go through this effort to find his remains, which they eventually did find after a multi-decade search. It's just an amazing story, and he was an amazing man. The other story that we got into just a few weeks ago was about the Buchenwald Airmen, and specifically Rick Martinez, the son of this Rick Martinez, Frederick C. Martini. I'm sorry, not Martinez, Martini, Fred and Rick Martini. Rick Martini wrote a book called Betrayed about his father. And I can't remember exact number, 186 Allied.
168 Americans.
68 who actually were shot down, captured by the Gestapo or the SS, and were put in Buchenwald instead of one of the Stalag Luft camps.
Yes, Steve Snyder, his father, was on the ground in the resistance at that time when those guys were captured, and just there, but for the grace of God, Steve Snyder's father was not one of them.
Yeah. And I got the book. I just got it a few days ago. I'm going to read it. There's an excellent documentary on this, and we're going to have the producer of that documentary, who Marilyn has worked with, on later this fall. It's just a tragic story. You mentioned the march. Again, this is something I learned more and more about, and the suffering that took place by our POWs as they were marched in the middle of winter in horrendous conditions from camp to camp in an effort to, I suppose, keep them from the Russians as they came closer and closer, and the suffering that occurred here. And again, I think the enlisted men suffered more than the officers, because they were in poor shape to begin with, and they were literally almost starved to death during their march. I think I recall him telling us they were out in the open in January and February in Northern Europe, 47, something like that, consecutive days. Last couple of points. We didn't do it alone. The RAF Bomber Command, who flew at night, as we talked about, this is a British Lancaster, actually carried heavier bomb load at a longer range than the 17 and the 24. RAF Bomber Command played a huge role in the air war. 50,000 men from the RAF Bomber Command killed in action during the war. 50,000 men. It's just an unbelievable sacrifice, right? And then finally, at the end of the war, there was a lot of questions about whether the bombing was worth it. And there was a study done, the Strategic Air Survey, something like that. I can't remember the full title of it. And it cast a lot of doubts as to whether the bombing was worth it. And these are shots of the German cities that we bombed into oblivion. And I think modern scholars these days have no doubt, have come to the conclusion that there's no doubt that the bombing had a significant effect on ending the war earlier than it would have otherwise. The destruction to the German economy in 1943 was not what we had hoped it would be. But once we had command of the air, and once we had literally thousands of bombers in the air, dropping millions of tons of bombs, both at night by the RAF and us during the day, it really took out so much infrastructure, particularly the oil campaign, which is what we're not getting into tonight, that obviously in a modern army, modern military, if you don't have oil to run the machines, you don't have a military. And that did make a big difference. So that's my version of what I learned on my summer camp, which has been just thrilling. I've enjoyed every minute of it, and enjoyed meeting people like Colin and Nancy and Marilyn Walton and so many others, 6 veterans that we interviewed, which was a thrill to still have that many veterans that we could interview. And I just wanted to try to bring it to some conclusion, but we're going to keep doing programs through the fall and into the winter. Not quite as many, not every Thursday night like we did in the past, but there's more to tell. So, questions, comments, observations? anything we can discuss.
There was a question. Does anyone know the name of the artists from the paintings for Ed Cottrell's paintings? Barbara asked.
Maybe Ed Cottrell knows.
Ed, do you know the name of the?
I don't know the name of the artist, but if you contact Valor Studio, Adam Makis, he can give you the name of the artist.
Yes. Yes.
Okay, hopefully that answers your question there, Barbara.
Adam
Terry
Makis
asked.
He's a young man, written a couple of books on World War II, on the air war in World War II. The first book was
Higher Call.
Higher Call.
Higher call, yeah.
Highly recommend it. We should reach out to have Adam on the program someday.
I'll call him for you.
Thank you, Colin.
From Terry, where was 9th Air Force located in Europe?
So initially in England, because the continent was occupied by the Germans. Once we took Normandy and began to advance, then as Ed Cottrell can tell you very well, we began to build air bases on the continent for the 9th Air Force, mostly for the P-47s. I've actually been in touch with something called the B-26 Association. I've sent them a couple of emails. I haven't gotten anything back from them yet because it kind of hit me. We've not really gotten into any discussion about the B-26s, and they were part of the 9th Air Force, the tactical element.
Right.
Anything else, Sean, in the chat?
Scrolling. No, just scrolling through. I do not see any other questions. Any hands raised? I'm looking around the room to see if there's any hands being waved. Or raised hands. I do not see anything.
Well, it's 8:32. Let me thank Ed for being on with us tonight. Thank you so much. I hope we hit all the highlights. Colin, Steve, Nancy, thanks for your contributions. You guys have taught me so much in the past 6 months. I appreciate it. I wish Marilyn could have been on tonight, but I think she was out traveling or something. So we'll continue in this vein. Come when I get back from England in October, we'll have some more programs scheduled about the air war over Europe. We're not going to have too much programming in August because travel, so it's so nice. We'll have a couple of things. We have the Guadalcanal show on August 1. That's in honor of Brad Washbaugh and the other Marines that, hi, Brad, Captain Brad. Anyway, it's not the end. I didn't mean this to be the culmination of of the air war over Europe. I just wanted to try to bring it all together in one event. So thank you very much for your time, and thanks very much for all your effort and contributions to the Veterans Breakfast Club. Sean, thank you as always for being my co-pilot.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Glenn. Thank you, everyone. We'll see you Monday night. Have a wonderful weekend.
Thank you.
Couple of great Monday night programs coming up.
Mm-hmm.